Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head. I'm Carrie Oderman with UATV. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has signed a decree to create the Council of Freedom of Speech and Protection of Journalists to discuss the challenges journalists face now and ways to promote freedom of the media in Ukraine. We welcome to our studio again today Matthew Schaaf, Director of Freedom House Ukraine. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Hello, happy to be here.
You just came from a meeting at the Verkhovna Rada and have had a busy few days. Freedom House has just released an internet study. Let's start with that.
Sure. So yesterday we released our Freedom on the Net report, which is a report on net freedom in 66 countries in the world, including Ukraine. And the report looks at a number of different things, and so three main areas of questions that we look at are obstacles to access. So, do people have access to the internet? Can they use it, and so on? Limitations on content. So, is certain content limited? What's the process for limiting content? And also violations of users' rights. And so Ukraine is considered partly free in our methodology under this report, like in our other reports, which means that certainly there are many good things, but there are also many serious challenges. In particular, we see for Ukraine challenges in limits on content and violations of users' rights. So, for example, sanctions that have led to blockages of websites, of numerous websites, which also happened in the past year. That falls under limitations on content, and it's a limitation on content and on specific questions. Violations of users' rights. There have been some incidents of criminal prosecution of individuals for things that they've said online. So these are the kinds of things that we look at, and these are the kinds of things that contribute to concerns about internet freedom in Ukraine.
Now, a country where people can say what they think and not be punished for that on the internet or in the media is a sign of a good and healthy democracy. Today we're going to talk a little bit now about how journalists are faring here. You were just at a meeting at the Rada.
Sure.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I was at a hearing of the Free Speech Committee, and it was actually in the plenary hall. So there were a lot of people there from across the media, from across civil society, from across the government, and I think that's a really good sign that all these people gathered to discuss, in particular, journalist safety and protection of journalists, which is a real serious issue in Ukraine. There are a number of incidents of violence, of attacks against journalists, and they continue to this day. And of course, there have also been murders of journalists, quite unfortunately. In the last few years, there have been 3 murders of journalists in Ukraine. And so the point of this hearing was to sort of identify the issues and try to come up with some solutions. One of the main challenges is the poor response of law enforcement authorities. It's the law enforcement authorities' job to respond to incidents when they happen, to investigate them and to hold people accountable. But the reality is that there is very little accountability for violence and threats to journalists in Ukraine these days.
Well, it's a nice gesture. Since the beginning of 2019, there's been 20 attacks on members of the press in Ukraine. The Zelensky administration doesn't have a very good reputation with the press either. The head of his administration, Andrei Bogdan, has said that the press is spilling dirt and lies on him, and his own media spokesperson, there's footage of her shoving journalists. How is this council that he's created, which is only acting in advisory, going to help journalists?
So I think it's fair to say that the Zelensky administration, his office, does not have a lot of credit right now for coming out in support of the media, of journalists, and so there's work to be done. They have in the past said, oh well, we don't need journalists to communicate with the public; we can do it directly. Which in our opinion ignores the fact that journalists play a really important role in society in helping people understand what the government is doing, what are the policies, how will they impact the population, and so on. Now, this creation of the Freedom of Speech Committee under the president is a good sign, but it hasn't. There are no results of this yet. There are good people on the committee, and so that's also a good sign. But what the result will look like is not clear. In the past, there had been a committee under the previous president that was focused on looking at specific cases of attacks on journalists and bringing law enforcement authorities to the committee to report on the progress of investigations. And that was seen as a productive and useful activity because the law enforcement was made to answer to the questions of not only the president's administration, but also journalist community and civil society and so on. But we don't know what's going to happen with this committee. I hope it's a strong and effective body.
Freedom House works worldwide. I'm sure there's been similar examples. What can you learn from other situations that you could maybe suggest be implemented in Ukraine to increase safety of journalism and freedom of the press? So
one of the recommendations that we share all the time is the need for consultation. And so this committee would, I think, very well fit the bill for a consultative process. In the past, there had not always been good consultation, and policies had been developed without the participation of experts, for example, of the media community, of human rights community, which has a lot to contribute to resolving what is generally believed or considered to be problems in Ukraine. We don't have a situation where law enforcement officials say it's okay to attack a journalist or okay to murder a journalist. The problem is in what are they doing to prevent these attacks and to respond to these attacks. So the consultation is a good step and something that we recommend quite often. Also, transparency is something that we recommend quite often. The reality is that law enforcement oftentimes seems like a black box, and there are legitimate reasons why law enforcement needs to withhold certain information when they're doing an investigation of something, but they need to maximize the opportunities to share with the public what they're doing, why they're doing it, and also sort of what the progress of those investigations is to assure people that they're doing their job. Because there, unfortunately, is a deficit of faith in that right now.
How does that work? Law enforcement would investigate a crime, but sometimes journalists have need for protection, proactive protection, so they aren't injured, so no crime is committed. How is Ukraine on that end, recognizing journalists in danger?
So Ukraine actually has a specific criminal code article that is supposed to protect journalists. It essentially criminalizes interference in journalistic activity. It's not perfect, for sure, in terms of the wording and how it's structured, and it's far from perfect in how it's been implemented. The reality is that this article, which could prevent or could sort of apply to not only incidents of violence, but other types of activities that are reasonably understood to interfere in journalist activity. But it's very rarely used. And so, for example, when there's an attack on a journalist, oftentimes, if the case is investigated, if the police come, the perpetrators are charged with hooliganism or something of that sort, when it's pretty clear that the purpose of the attack was to frighten a journalist, to somehow interfere in their activity. So this criminal code article is not used. So that's one possible sort of reform, is improving this article so that it creates better tools for responding to these crimes in Ukraine, and then also working with law enforcement so that they actually use the tools that are available to them.
I'm sure you're aware that there's a World Press Freedom Index, and Ukraine is ranked 101. Well, Norway was ranked first in 2019. What kind of parameters are used to judge this? And what kind of advice would you give Ukraine to improve this beyond what you've already said?
Yeah, so certainly sort of dealing with violence and attacks against journalists is really important. We've spoken about that already. But to be honest, I think that would go a long way. I think there's also an issue with pluralism in media in Ukraine, and the fact that people that are sharing certain opinions, are sharing information of a certain nature, can also be targeted not just with violence, but also potentially threats, intimidation, criminal persecution. This is going to what I was mentioning before about our Freedom on the World report, that persecution for things that have been said online, there's also persecution for things that have been said offline. A lot of it these days has to do with the conflict, and so their journalists report that there are certain topics that they stay away from, and so this is self-censorship. And some of these topics are related to separatism, terrorism, and Russia, but not only. Questions of the church and religion are part of that. Questions about gender and sexuality and sexual orientation and those things. And so there cannot be a free press when there are prohibited themes and topics. And of course, it's not a ruling on high that you can't talk about this issue or talk about that issue, but that there are various pressure points that are contributing to this environment where journalists feel like it's very difficult to report and talk about these issues. And it's sort of economic pressure, political pressure, certainly physical pressure is a possibility. And so that would be another big area where Ukraine could make some significant progress in press freedom in addressing these issues.
Thank you very much for sharing your time with us today.
You're welcome.
That was Matthew Schaaf, Director of Freedom House Ukraine. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.